Welcome to another episode of Bleav in the Broncos on the Bleav Network. I am Patrick Chiotti. I'm one of your hosts of this program. Joining me, as always, is Bri Maestas. Bri, hello. How you doing?
Fantastic. Right smack dab in the middle of camp season.
Love it. And joining us today, very special guest, host of the Hack City Pod and the Ruffino Joe Show, NFL Draft Analyst, college football analyst, and former long snapper. That I appreciate. Joe DeLeone. Joe, thanks for joining the show, man. How you doing?
Doing great. I'm very excited to chat with both of you about the Broncos draft plans, and hopefully Denver can come out with some great picks.
Yeah, man. I'm very excited. It's the smack dab middle of draft season. Bri's in camp season. We're in draft season. Last year was a really important draft for the Broncos. They had to nail their picks, especially that first round pick. With it being a quarterback, it was very essential for them to nail that pick and kind of get into what Sean Payton wanted to do going forward with this team after the Russell Wilson experience. First question, Joe, we're just going to lay it out there. What's your favorite pick from last year's Broncos draft class? Doesn't have to be.
Well, it for me, it is Bo Nix. I mean, the fact that you're able to get a guy to start as early as he did and be a driving force for their transformation and their success. I mean, that has to be the no-brainer for me. And I think that the best part about Bo Nix's success is the amount of people who poo-pooed on that pick and just immediately assume like, hey, he doesn't fit with Sean Payton's offense. He's not going to work. The way that he was playing in college, it's not translatable. I thought all that was a bunch of BS. I didn't buy into any of that. I thought that his touch and his timing, his decision-making, his accuracy, all of those things were ideal for what Sean Payton was going to be looking for. And now we're on to this upcoming draft class where Payton is set up with an already stellar defense to find more of a well-rounded supporting cast, more weapons, quality running backs. There is a real chance for them to have back-to-back home run classes to set them up for more success.
Love it.
I love how you're speaking towards they're on the right path there. Denver's found its quarterback. The trenches are beefed up substantially, and it leaves multiple paths for success in this draft. Do you feel there's any mid to late round sleepers who could fit in the Broncos' current situation as it stands?
Yeah, I think that in this current draft class, there's a lot of opportunities for them to fit those needs for them to really propel themselves forward offensively. And I think that the two positions that I'm paying the most attention to is, three: wide receiver, tight end, and running back. They've got quality players at all those positions, but if you end up getting a steal like you're talking about, you end up taking that huge step forward. At running back, this is an incredibly deep running back class. I feel like in the history of Sean Payton, he's always either had like these really spark plug type running backs that are impactful in the passing game, or he's had some really physical, hard-nosed runners. I like the idea of Taj Brooks from Texas Tech as a day 3 sleeper. I actually just had him on A to Z Film Room, which is the YouTube channel, draft channel I do with my co-host Ryan Roberts, and he was really fun to talk to because he has a very aggressive mentality and play style. I think that he would work for that approach for the Broncos. And I also think that somebody like Devin Neal from Kansas, who's got great vision and patience, navigates through rushing lanes really well, is a name to keep track of for the Broncos. To talk about some of the receivers very briefly, really like Caden Prather, big-bodied guy from Maryland, inconsistent hands, but very fluid mover at 6'3", over 200 pounds, ran in the 4.4s at the NFL Combine, so he had some really good testing numbers. And then lastly, a tight end that maybe fits for them. Depending on, he might end up going a little bit earlier, but I really like the thought of Mason Taylor, the LSU tight end, maybe being somebody late in the third round or in the second round for the Broncos to target because he's an underrated blocker. He's a very smooth route runner, and he's got some pretty strong, reliable hands that you can count on.
Yeah, I think Taylor has a coaching connection as well with the Broncos. I think that's a player that kind of all of Broncos country is hoping that they go get. But Joe, this class doesn't have the same hype as far as like top tier talent. I've seen a lot of rumors about GMs only having like between 9 and 14 first round grades on some of these players. So it doesn't make it like a super sexy class in terms of, trading up or anything like that. But let's say that there is a scenario where the Denver Broncos do trade up from the 20th pick in the draft. Is there a player that you think that the Broncos should absolutely go get in this class that can make an immediate impact for the Broncos on either side of the ball?
I think that there's one position and two guys, and I know that tight end keeps getting talked about a lot with the Broncos. It's the one position where I know that they just signed Evan Ingram, but like I feel if you can get a player to mold for what Sean Payton has produced for tight ends in his history as a head coach, that is something that's kind of like that missing piece. Evan Ingram could be a good player, but if you're able to get Colston Loveland or Tyler Warren, that's the player that you go and trade up for. I don't think that Tyler Warren is going to make it out of the top 10, but if he theoretically falls and it's like pick 12, pick 13, that does feel like a Sean Payton type of a move, and it feels like a Sean Payton type of a guy. It kind of makes me think of if he used Taysom Hill the way that he did and was using him as this dynamic weapon, why not go and get the most dynamic weapon in college football this past year that played center and scored a touchdown? He played Wildcat quarterback. He played running back. He played tight end. He played out wide. He did everything for Penn State. And I think Payton should be more than excited by that opportunity. But Colston Loveland's also a great option. And if they didn't want to miss out on getting him with other teams in the teens that are eyeing tight ends and might want Colston Loveland, he can be a great vertical threat for that Broncos offense.
Yeah,
I love that idea too with the acquisition of Evan Ingram. There's a little soft spot there for the Denver Broncos having the failed Greg Dulcich experiment kind of blow up in their face, right? So not only are they looking for insurance there, but the current roster still needs a potential tight end one. But the other position you mentioned was running back, and it's fit in the NFL and the overall narrative that continues to evolve. Teams are gunning for their own Saquon Barkleys, or committees like the Lions had in these last couple of years. Where do you think Denver should realistically draft a running back? Is it going to be early rounds? Are we looking at a day 3, both?
I actually think that this running back class, knowing that like the current needs of the Broncos running back room, and like, you know, right now, Jaleel McLaughlin and Audric Estime are listed as your top 2 running backs. I like Estime. I hope that he takes the step forward that I think everybody was hoping that he could in year 2, but I wouldn't be surprised if a team like the Broncos doesn't double dip with all the options that they have at running back in this class, taking a guy who can be your primary runner and then taking somebody to compete with Estime for that 3rd spot on the roster, depending on how Payton views him. But specifically, though, like the earliest and best opportunity for them, it's such a deep class that they can be patient. I just put out a mock draft where actually in the first round, I had them taking Omarion Hampton in the first round. And I feel like that would be a type of the only guy worth considering in the first round for them. And maybe somehow Genty falls that far, which I don't think is going to happen, could be worth considering. But Hampton brings a powerful and explosive profile. He, to me, reminds me a lot of Marshawn Lynch. I think he could be Marshawn Lynch in the NFL. Very similar testing numbers, very similar build, loves to run through people. Outside of that, I think that the Broncos should really be intentional about 2nd or 3rd round grabbing one of these guys, whether it is DJ Giddens, who is a nice patient runner with a big frame and some good burst, or somebody like Trevion Henderson, who is a spark plug every single time he touches the football and could maybe play a little bit of that Alvin Kamara role that he once had when he was in New Orleans.
Yeah, we don't say the word. No, it's the Joker role, right? He's talked about it, you know, throughout this whole offseason, last offseason, kind of looking for a player that has those specific skill sets. And I think Henderson checks off all the boxes. I really, really like Hampton. Your description of him was spot on. Just a really tough runner. And he does kind of fit where Sean Payton is going offense-wise. The last couple of years with Javonte Williams, trying to run a ton of zone, Javonte just did not have the burst, didn't have the vision for it, and then plus coming off of the injury, just kind of like trying to fit, circle into a square. Like it wasn't fitting.
Right.
But I think Hampton fits. Giddens would certainly be a fit. Henderson kind of fits that role. Estime is so weird. Like it's so odd because he was trying to do a similar thing with Estime last year too, putting him in a bunch of zone situations, but then he puts him in gap situations and Estime is just booming. So I think he's kind of found his thunder. Now he's looking for that complete back or the lightning, so to say. Joe, is there a certain pick or position that the Broncos would take in round one where you would say, I don't think this was the way that you should have gone. I don't think that this was the position group that you probably should have addressed. George Paton has talked about this offseason about adding where they're already kind of good. So defensive line, offensive line, they're kind of already set in those positions, but he didn't rule out necessarily taking a player at those positions. Is there a certain position or player that you would see being a quote unquote bust? I'm not going to call the player a bust, but just that wouldn't be the position that you would go with.
Yeah, I think that a lot of different spots on defense would fit that for me with the Broncos, because they got so much production and quality play out of, I don't want to call them non-premier, but like non-household name defensive players. I think that the one that would really stick to me is if they drafted a cornerback. You have Chris Abrams-Drain and Riley Moss listed on your depth chart, and as your opposite corner of Pat Surtain. And I think that when you already have a defensive player of the year caliber guy in Pat Surtain, you don't really need to go after a corner in the first round. You can certainly do it later on in the draft. You could do it on day 2 or day 3. It's not a super deep corner class, so you might miss out on some opportunities. But I would think corner would probably be the one that sticks out to me, or at safety after you already invested money at signing Talanoa Hufanga. After signing him, I think that would be a little questionable if they drafted Malachi Starks or if they drafted Nick Emenwari, who are great football players, who any team would love to have them, but it just might feel a little odd after the financial investment this free agency.
I was just going to ask you if you'd be shocked by that choice or not, because they already have a full roster there at safety, as you've mentioned. Yeah. My whole thing, though, year after year, is you can never have enough DBs. It's just injury prone. You run into that fractured mindset of like, is 9 enough? And you're like, no, it never is, right? And so the recent mocks seem nightmarish, I think, for Broncos country, because I think along with what you were saying, most of the fandom would be a little bit upset if that was the pick, that if it tended to fall that way. But with Emenwari and his physical traits, I think I love a good story that has elite physical traits, a great story, whether or not they're from a lesser known school, a smaller minor conference. So regardless of whether this player or these players would end up on the Broncos, are there any prospects that are testing off the charts and rocketing up boards lately? Because we're just past the combine human stock show period. We're headed into the real nitty gritty of the draft season. Is there anyone that fits that bill for you?
Yeah, I think that the first guy that immediately comes to mind that's been really driving is Armand Membou from Missouri. Membou is a very fluid moving tackle / guard prospect. He tested incredibly well. He had the fastest 40 time for an offensive lineman. He was screaming throughout all of his through his entire 40 run. If anyone missed that, it was pretty odd. But he earned that intensity, and he plays with that intensity. He is somebody who I wouldn't be shocked, from what I've heard, if he ends up being the first offensive lineman taken, and if he doesn't end up being maybe even a top 5 pick. I would pay attention to if the Patriots maybe consider taking him. A team like the Jaguars could take him. There are a lot of teams in the top 10 that need just a little bit more well-roundedness on their offensive line, and we know that athleticism is always prioritized when picking offensive linemen early.
Joe, she's talking about lesser known prospects, and there's always that sleeper pick in the draft, right? That maybe not a lot of people thought would even get drafted. Who's your sleeper pick for the whole draft? Not just for Denver, but for the whole draft.
My guy that I keep pushing is Charles Grant from William & Mary. And I can't really call him a sleeper anymore because I think a lot of people know about him, but I like to claim his name because 2 years ago when I was doing work for a scouting agency, I had spotted his film when he was 270 pounds at William & Mary. And I had brought him to the table to recommend to agents. One of the agents that we met with had shot him down and said that he was too light, that it wasn't, it's not worth an investment. And he bulked up 300 pounds and his tape has been phenomenal. He is super, super flexible. He moves so well. His technique's super raw, though. This is a guy, and he needs to get stronger. This is a guy who, like, in 2 years could end up becoming a Pro Bowler and a consistent Pro Bowler. But he's going to take a little bit of time before he actually can play at the level of hope here. He might not even step in and start for a period of time because he's so raw. But I think that Charles Grant, somewhere in the 3rd round, maybe early 4th round, could plug in, play center, guard, or he could play tackle because he's long enough. That multiple usability and the rawness allowing for a team to mold him. But yeah, without a doubt, the one sleeper that I always push, I love to talk about Charles Grant.
I love that. That's a good story, Bri.
Yeah, it is a good story. And it kind of ties into the idea that maybe Broncos country isn't exactly looking at offensive linemen in this draft specifically, but that's the greatest mishap you could possibly have, because you're not trying to get towards that tackle depth. You're not looking at versatility. Quinn Bailey, who's the jack of all trades for the Denver Broncos, went down this past offseason, and now they're really lacking the variability of switching someone throughout all the positions without really missing a step, which I think is kind of the worst thing that could happen to this Denver Broncos team, right? You're still trying to protect Bo Nix and counter his development and maybe a little bit of regression there in year 2. So it begs the question of, is that immediate help? Is that long-term depth? What really should the Broncos be focusing on when it comes to the trenches on the offensive side of the ball?
Yeah, I think that when you already have enough quality starters, and especially that you're doing so well at both tackle spots, you got McGlinchey and you've got Bowles at both tackle spots, that like you don't really need to reestablish a presence at both those positions. And I think that the overall floor of the group is tremendously high. They played at a very high level. I think that, as you were talking about there, is this draft class does present some options at the end of day 2, beginning of day 3, for a team like the Broncos to just grab players that have tools that they can develop and have rotate as backup players that have the upside to start once maybe somebody's contract is up if they want to have a cheaper option. So I think that within this class, that there doesn't need to be so much of a focus on going after offensive linemen. But if they're really, really caught by somebody's traits or skills like a Charles Grant, and they just want to stash him on the roster, they have the ability to do so. Unlike some other teams that desperately need offensive linemen to step in, that would force Charles Grant to play sooner and then maybe ruin his development.
Joe, defensive line. We're going to switch over on the trenches. Defensive line was a very big, strong suit for the Denver Broncos last year. Zach Allen had a fantastic year. John Franklin Myers coming over from New York. That was a fantastic move. Only cost him a 6th-round pick. If the Broncos were to go defensive line with their first pick, who's a prospect that you think fits the best with the Broncos around that 20 range?
Yeah, I think that a couple of options are 2 that come to mind. Kenneth Grant, potentially from Michigan, big-bodied, 330-pound tackle, could start at nose for you right away. He's got really light feet, reminds me a lot of Dexter Lawrence. I know that it's like not like a super major big need for the Broncos, but like if they were just so blown away by his physical tools, like he moves at a ridiculous level for a big man of his size. And then the other, I really like projecting Derek Harmon for a lot of teams from Oregon because he's got a long frame, he's got good power, he's got good pad level, and he can play different schemes. He can play different positions. He can play a 1 tech. He can play head up as a nose. He could play as a 5 tech and a 3-4. So someone like him that you don't need to be scheme specific. I think that Derek Harmon is certainly worth consideration. I just feel overall, though, that like with how many good defensive tackles there are in this class, it would really just benefit the Broncos for waiting, going somewhere on day 2 or day 3. On day 3, you could end up getting a starting caliber guy. There's just that many good defensive linemen.
I think it fits into kind of what you're saying there too, that there's a lot of in-betweeners as well. Maybe players don't fit so cleanly on the edge or in the interior. The Broncos pass rush obviously is in good sorts, but could they benefit from a player? We talked about versatility on the O-line. What about the D-line? Are there players that could fit that mold?
Yeah, I think that in consideration, like having a designated pass rusher, and if we're talking like names that make sense in the first round, like I wouldn't be shocked, like a Donovan Ezeraku from Boston College, really great hand usage, very explosive in short areas, not a great run defender, So he didn't end up being like a super highly ranked edge player, but for a team specifically like the Broncos that are in this position where they've already got like a really good unit, but if they wanted to just have like a really specific designated pass rusher, he could make some sense. It's kind of like last year how Chop Robinson went to the Dolphins, where they had a good collection. They had a good collection of guys on their defensive line, but Robinson, not as great of a run defender. His athletics skill set is so exciting for that defense that it was worth taking the chance, bringing him into the fold, and he was decently productive this past year for the Dolphins.
Joe, I always appreciate your draft takes. And as a special teams guy, the Broncos let Riley Dixon walk in free agency. They've signed Matt Hack, who did not impress me last year. I know there's a couple of punters in this class. I'm not saying the Broncos should draft a punter, but I know there's a couple punters in this class. Give me your favorite punter. If you've watched any, if you've been paying attention, I gotta know, because there's one dude in mind, and I want to see if I'm on the right track.
Okay, I haven't admittedly broken down any punting tape, but I have talked to some people about this one guy who I think has some potential. Jeremy Crawshaw, the Florida punter, who a lot of people think that he has the potential to be a good quality starting punter, but I am as a former long snapper, I'm very anti-drafting specialists, because a lot of times you'll find better players that are veterans that have gotten invited to camps that their third time around end up sticking with the team. A lot of times the guys that end up actually working are not always the players that are drafted. And you end up wasting capital on a player that you might end up cutting because you don't have depth. You can't draft a punter and think like, oh, maybe he can just sit on our bench if he's not ready to go or he's struggling a little bit. No, you have to cut that guy, and then you have to bring somebody else in. You have to bring in new competition. It's a whole process to find new specialists. So I'm anti-drafting. Jeremy Crawshaw is one guy, though, that I've heard some really good things about, maybe worth signing.
Yeah, we had some people down at the Senior Bowl. They said the same thing about Crawshaw. So very interested to see if the Broncos maybe kick around with bringing a punter in. Bri, do you have a last question for Joe?
I'm kind of just interested to know whether or not you think there will be aggressiveness in the movement in the first round that occupies the Broncos' place at 20, because I think we talked too much about 20 being the pick, and I don't think 20 is going to be the pick. How do you feel about the Broncos and where they sit in the first round?
Yeah, I'm not sure if the Broncos are going to move, but I think that if there's any aggressive movement, the first guy that I think is going to trigger it is Abdul Carter. If Abdul Carter not like slides dramatically, but moves a little bit and he's hovering around pick 5, I think a team like the Atlanta Falcons could end up trading up. I think that the Houston Texans are a trade-up candidate as well, because they need an offensive lineman. They have to draft an offensive lineman. And if there's an early run on offensive line with scarcity at that position, they could be like in panic mode, like, oh my God, we have to go up and get somebody. Otherwise, we're going to miss out. We need just anybody at any spot on their offensive line to plug things. I think it would make sense, though, in that line, though, for the Broncos to maybe consider trading back if they're just looking to round out their roster, get more starting caliber players in a draft class that has a ton of day 2 depth.
Love it.
Thank you.
Joe DeLeone, thank you so much. Tell the people where they can find your work.
Yeah, catch me on X at Joe DeLeone, and then be sure to check out the A to Z Sports Film Room channel with me and my co-host Ryan Roberts, where we are doing our position rankings right now. We have a lot of great scouting reports on first-round prospects, and on draft night, we'll be dropping some instant reactions to some of the most interesting picks. It was great getting to catch up with both of you. Yeah. I'm so glad that we got to do this, and let's try to connect after the draft, and hopefully the Broncos have a good class.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
For Bri, I'm Patrick Chiotti. This has been Bleav in the Broncos.